Hi, this is Corey Johnston. In today's lesson, I'm going to share some thoughts on Proverbs 30. And the beauty of these thoughts is not their uniqueness, but the fact that they are not the only thoughts. Now, if propaganda's goal is to do people for them, Old Testament wisdom literature stands on the opposite and more exalted end of the same spectrum. It stimulates thoughts within the reader. So the thoughts are there are as many interpretations as there are readers, and I don't want to limit you to my interpretation alone, but my ultimate goal is to inspire the impulse to think about things creatively and originally. And the 30th chapter marks a distinct turning point in the book of Proverbs, the likes of which we haven't witnessed since the 10th chapter. And we witness in the chapters 1 through 9, they seem to be not more systematic and oriented towards an identified object of expression, whereas those which come after it are seemingly more arbitrary and scattered. The relational resemblance between a verse and its predecessor and post, the one that comes after it, may not be identifiable, at least not immediately. So it's really, now Proverbs themselves are pithy sayings of condensed wisdom, so they really pack a punch. They're more than the sum of their parts. It's the art of saying as much as possible while saying as little as necessary. And the Proverbs are not unique as a literary device to the Hebrew people, but what makes theirs unique, and I would dare I say superior to any other cultures, is the inspiration. That is to say, divine inspiration. These were written and directed by the Ruach Kadesh, translated through Solomon. Yet in the 30th chapter, we also witness that Solomon himself stops writing. These are attributed to, the first verse reads, "The words of Agar, son of Jakeh, a message. This man declared to Ithiel, and you call." So Solomon wrote the majority of the book of Proverbs and also collected in the 31st chapter. Lemuel is identified as the source. Now, he may have been transmitting from other cultures because these are Near Eastern but not quite Hebrew names. So we read, in the East, wisdom was a highly valuable commodity, and Solomon was famous for his superiority to all the Easterners. We read in 1 Kings, the 4th chapter. Yet he was humble enough to, the fact is, just because our religion claims the fullness of truth doesn't mean we have a monopoly on truth. There are, in fact, valuable insights from outside the Christian faith and philosophy, and our policy should be one that we witness in Solomon. We should affirm it, uphold it, and utilize it to our advantage. So the second verse reads, "For I am more stupid than anyone, and do not have the understanding of a man. And I have not learned wisdom, that I should know the knowledge of the Sacred One." So the foundational point from which we must approach our studies of divinity has a parallel in the philosophical precept of Socratic ignorance. We can read of a scriptural affirmation of the philosophical precept in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 2. But the idea is that the foundational point for wisdom is knowing that you know nothing and knowing that he knows everything in the specific field of philosophy. So we have to approach him. The foundation of wisdom consists in a recognition of your own ignorance. We are all finite beings with finite capacities, including intelligence, but the one above us, identified here as the Sacred One, knows all. So we can, if we wish to grow wise, we must submit ourselves to the source of all wisdom. Now, sacred is an intrinsic quality, and even though he's identified as the Sacred One, he is the source of this quality, which we are reflected to emulate. Throughout the book of Leviticus, we read, "Be sacred because I am sacred." And that has a New Testament citation in 1 Peter 1:16. But the question is, what is sacred? And there's plenty of room for error on this issue, because it's neither a sterile entity like a surgical knife, cured of defilement, nor is it an exclusively negative attribute which rejects and omits all things which aren't sacred, but it is very often a positive manifestation. We witness in the action-oriented manifestation of this attribute. It is a positive quality with negative qualities too, but its ultimate benefact is positive, and we can reflect the sacredness that he radiates, and that's what those injunctions come with attached to. Who has gone up to the heavens and come down? Who has gathered the wind in his fist? Who has bound the waters in a garment? Who established all the ends of the earth? What is his name, and what is the name of his son, if you know? Now, we had earlier mentioned that Agar was not an Israelite, so from this we can gather that Israel was the primary, although not exclusive, possessors of revelation of the Almighty. Some tricklets, many of which originated from them, reached other cultures. They weren't an isolated civilization. They were commanded to be separate in as much as they were able, but they still had interactions with other people. And the advances of one civilization can benefit another. So we read, for instance, that the Magi, who were Persian wise men of sorts, were privy to the prophecy in Malachi, and they came to visit divinity in the flesh. Now here, this other foreigner has a conception of the divine son. He knows that he has a son, and when he did come in the flesh, now we work with what we know, so we can't be too hard on the Israelites, because they were told in Genesis 3:15 that the Redeemer would be born of a woman. So they knew he would be human, that is to say, distinct from an angel, yet they had no way of knowing. None of their prophecies allude to it, the divinity of the flesh. And ultimately they crucified him for blasphemy, according to the dictates of Leviticus 24:16. Yet they couldn't accept the fact that Elohim would invest himself in a human form. It was simply inconceivable and incompatible with their preconception of divinity. Every word of Eloha is refined. He is a shield to those taking refuge in him. Do not add to his words, lest he reprove you, and you be found a liar. So there's Eloha, first off, is the singular tense of Elohim. Elohim is the plural form, which is derived from the most elemental name, which translates as God in our language, that is El. And he's identified throughout the book of Job as Eloha in various locations sporadically. But they most frequently referred to him as Elohim, perhaps without knowing that he was a plural entity. Now, even in the Jews' confession of monotheism, Deuteronomy 6:5, the word Yahweh is one. Yahweh is our Elohim. The word one, in its pristine Hebrew form, refers to a compound one. So they had hints of the Trinity, or that Elohim was not one person alone. He's strictly speaking one entity, but he has three forms: Father, Son, and Spirit. And now the word being refined, this is, and the consequent warning, do not add to his words lest he prove you found a liar. So there's no gain. And there is Deuteronomy 4:2 and 12:32, Moses says, do not add to any of these words or take away. And in Revelation 22:17 through 18, or maybe 18 through 19, we read of the most dire consequences attached to this principle. The plagues will come upon them. So Solomon was writing under the influence of the Ruach Hadesh, as was Moses and every other author, inspired author of Scripture, including John, who the authorship of Revelation is attributed to. Yet we shouldn't presume to add anything to this book, at least elevate it to the same inspired standard. Now, he's also identified as a shield in this passage, and that is not a literal translation. Our personal standard for interpretation is, if the literal sense makes common sense, seek no other sense. But there are rare instances in which Yahweh is referred to metaphorically and anthropomorphically. Anthropomorphic means in human terms, because he's invisible and, quite frankly, inconceivable, but we can relate to him in familiar images. So he performs the same function as a shield. He protects us from spiritual danger. He keeps our soul. He keeps us away from harm if we seek him out in prayer. So don't look too much into the shield. We have to refer to him in worldly terms, even though he's an otherworldly being. 2 I have asked of you. Do not deny them to me before I die. Remove falsehood and a lying word far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me my portion of bread, lest becoming satisfied and I deny, and I say, Who is Yahweh? And lest I be poor and steal, and seize the name of my Elohim. So this is a request. The 2 priorities, he's asking a divine entity. We don't know if he knew him as Yahweh or Elohim or what, but it was sufficient enough proof of divine revelation for Solomon to abridge this foreigner's insights into his own account, his own collection of Proverbs. And so he's directing the question to divinity and their request, and lying is unbecoming of anyone because the societal function disrupts, and it's a contagious sin, and that one often has to lie to protect the lie. So it's a vicious trap and an endless cycle. There are people who cannot live without lies, nor function in social situations without it. And that's especially to be avoided by a king, and because they are the macrocosm of society is manifest in their microcosm. And poverty nor riches. Now, this is a request for middle classness, and the French author Victor Hugo once wrote, paraphrased, that wealth and poverty are comparative sins. Now, being wealthy and poverty in itself is, of course, not a sin. Socioeconomic is not, belonging to any socioeconomic status is not sinful, but they are the source of many sins. Being poor can actually compromise your spiritual health, because you'll be tempted to resort to unethical practices and your petty scraps to survive. It is a fact of life that people who are poor have to resort to things that people who aren't poor don't have to, because it's not a survival issue with us. And the trapping of wealth is that it can cause one to put their faith in it and their own abilities which got it, and neglect the source of all that wealth can buy. So we are never to prioritize the things money can buy at the expense of that which money cannot buy. And in heaven all will be equal, but socioeconomic status is a fact of life, which we have to put up with in as much as we are able while we walk on earth. And the great question is why a lot of people say, why would God create people poor? And, to some extent, this is where an interesting interlap of responsibility and agency and divine providence comes in. Now, strictly speaking, he left us to free will. So everything that we experience is the consequences of not only our own actions, but those around us and those who came before us. So some people he may providentially put in poor, that he put his son through abject poverty. He was technically homeless, but some people he may have purposes for. He may make them poor so they have the skills and experience from that hard scrap existence that will translate them into more effective servants. And some people he creates rich because Solomon, like the top, he set the godly example for the nation of Israel to follow. So long story short, our standing in this world's eye has exactly no bearing on our standing in heaven. Do not slander a servant to his master, lest he curse you, and ye be found guilty. So Solomon was a king. He had many servants, but he was empathetic enough to them to realize that many of them had as perfect as much as he ruled in perfect justice, and as much as he was able as a king. The fact is that some of the injustices may have escaped him at the lower levels. So this was a common occurrence. Servants were subjected to slander, and sometimes that's all it took to. They were easy scapegoats of sorts for someone to place their blame on, but they could be found guilty. Now, in an Israelite court of law, a truth or evidence was established by 2 or 3 witnesses. So, if they're and then the next verse reads, "There is a generation clean in its own eyes, but not washed away from its own filth." So sin blinds us. We don't think that we're sinning when we sin. When we're slaves to sin, we're not aware of the fact that we are enslaved or have any conception of how spiritually detrimental, not only personally, but also utilitarianly, we all inhabit the same world and have to at least try to make it better for those we coexist with. And now there's this generation is frequently praised in singing its laurels. The youth has really ascended to preeminence in modern times. And I also read an interesting article about this in the American Spectator, which is a conservative commentary which no longer publishes their magazines, but they identified the breaking point with Elvis Presley when the children really took over. And the fact is that children do not have the moral maturity that adults do, and we're to look to them. We are not only to set the example, but look to them for example. And that ties into some of the next verses, but that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.